Hi, and welcome to Fair Perspectives, the official podcast of the pro-human movement, brought to you by the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. I'm your host, angeleduardo, and I'll be flying solo today as my co-host, Melissa Chan, is away. Quick announcement before we get to our guest for this week. We're excited to share that members of Fair Community can now submit questions for upcoming Q&A episodes of Fair Perspectives. We want to give you the opportunity to ask Melissa and me questions about Fair, the pro-human movement, the podcast, and more. To sign up for Fair Community and submit your questions, visit us at fairperspectives.org. And now on to our guest. This week, I have the pleasure of speaking with Steven Pinker. Steven probably needs no introduction, but he's a cognitive psychologist, psycholinguist, popular science author, and public intellectual. He's won numerous prizes for his research, his teaching, and his books, including The Language Instinct, How the Mind Works, The Blank Slate, The Better Angels of Our Nature, The Sense of Style, Enlightmentnow, and most recently, Rationality, What It Is, Why It Seems Scarce, and Why It Matters. In this episode, I chat with Steven about his books, the public's responses to them, and whether those books have had a positive effect. We talk about the Euphemism Treadmill and whether we can ever escape it, the misunderstandings of terms like optimism and idealism, the tensions between human nature and the potential for progress, social media and the ways we can improve it, and how we can all be more rational. Ladies and gentlemen, Steven Pinker. Steven Pinker, thank you so much for joining us on Fair Perspectives.
Thanks for having me.
It is a true honor, sir. I have been a big fan of yours for a very long time. I have read not all of your books, but quite a lot, and they tend to be hefty. So I feel like a couple of Steven Pinker books is good for a lifetime, perhaps. And you know, you've profoundly influenced the way that I view the world, actually, particularly Enlightmentnow and The Better Angels of Our Nature really gave me a kind of, I guess a more empirical sort of foundation for what my actual kind of instincts were as just an optimistic sort of person, that the world is not as bleak as it seems, and that maybe it's about the feed that we're getting. And that really, if you zoom out enough, things are actually much better than they might appear. But I'm curious, now that you've written so many of these books speaking on these topics, if you've noticed that the books themselves have had an effect, if you've noticed that maybe you were able to push back against that tide of negativity bias and thinking everything is always going to hell in a handbasket.
Yes, well, it's a danger that I faced and continue to face is that people think the message is everything is just going to get better. Be an optimist, see the glass is half full, put on rose-colored glasses, which isn't the message. There's no guarantee that things will always get better. Some things do get worse. We have a war in Ukraine. We've got an increase in the American crime rate. We had COVID. And it would be magical thinking to think that things just do get better. Quite the contrary, the forces of nature have no particular interest in our well-being, and generally left to their own devices, things get worse. Things rot. Things decay. Those are the laws of the universe. The positive message is just that we can push back with knowledge, with energy. We can carve out benevolent zones of order in areas that affect us. We can reduce disease, we can reduce hunger, we can reduce violence, if we try to figure out how the world works, and if we try to figure out ways to make things better for human beings and other sentient creatures. And the reason, and that this might even seem obvious, but it isn't obvious, partly because, as you alluded to in your question, if your view of the world comes from the news, from journalism, it's going to be distorted. Not because there's some nefarious conspiracy among the mainstream media, but just the very nature of news, which is it's a non-random sample of things that happen. Things that happen in an instant are usually bad things, like an invasion, like a pandemic, a financial collapse, a rampage shooting. Improvements tend to be either things that don't happen, like a part of the world that is not at war, like Southeast Asia, which for decades was one of the world's most brutal places and hasn't had a real shooting war in many decades, but that's not a headline. or things that creep up gradually, a few percentage points a year, so that they can compound, such as the decline in extreme poverty, which over the last couple of centuries went from 90% of humanity to 9%. But it didn't happen on a Tuesday in October. So there was never a headline for that either. So the ways in which things aren't going to hell in a handbasket are hidden from us, which means that people can despair about the prospect of improving our lot. They can also be tempted toward radical and often nihilistic responses, such as, well, the whole system is so corrupt, so decadent, failing left and right. Let's just tear it down and start all over again, which history tells us can be a very dangerous way to change things. Or people can just say, well, what can we do? The poor will always be with you. Humans are naturally violent. There'll always be war. It's naive to think otherwise. Let's just enjoy ourselves and our families, and we're going to be cooked because of climate change anyway. So let's have a good time now and not try to do anything about it. So those are, I think, two of the dangerous messages that come from, I think, not having a view of the human condition as one in which the forces of the universe, including evolution and human nature, are kind of stacked against us, but we have the tools to fight back. And in the data on progress that I reproduce aren't saying that we're on an escalator that's just going to make things better and better, because we're not. What it says is that the hope of applying reason and science and humanism to improve our lot is not romantic, it's not naive, it's not a pipe dream. It's worked in the past. And so let's figure out what we did right and do more of it.
Yeah. And I think the beautiful thing about it for me is that, despite all our human flaws and failings and, challenges of just kind of battling our own instincts towards things like tribalism, we seem to have stumbled our way forward and done a fairly good job, all things considered, in spite of ourselves, right? So imagine if we paused for a moment to become more kind of cognizant of that fact and then harnessed it, and maybe imagine how much better we can do. Do you feel that as well, or?
Yeah, and it's ironic in a sense for me to be assigned the role of as an optimist, or sometimes even as a romantic thing, someone who believes in eventual perfectibility. Because I wrote a book called The Blank Slate, which argued that there is such a thing as human nature, and it's got a lot of rather nasty, ugly motives in it, instincts, like tribalism, like a suite of cognitive fallacies and biases, like nepotism, a desire to favor your own genetic relatives over strangers, like vengeance, the feeling that if someone has committed a sin, it is morally correct to make them suffer. And because we're that's part of human nature, I think they're intelligible evolutionary rationales for them. We're never going to have a utopia, and I argued as such in The Blank Slate. So it makes me an unlikely champion of progress. But the reason that I can say that with a straight face is, first of all, because that's what the data suggests. Lifespans really have doubled worldwide, more than doubled in the more fortunate countries, and rates of homicide and war have come down. But also because human nature is a complex system. It's not just one thing. It's got some nasty motives, but it also has capacities for empathy, capacities for self-control, capacities for cognitive processes that can solve problems, capacity for language so we can share our solutions and pool our collective wisdom. And I co-opted Abraham Lincoln's famous phrase, "the better angels of our nature," to capture the idea that there are lots of angels to our nature. Human nature has multiple components, and it's a question of coming up with the norms and the institutions that bring out our better angels. And despite the flaws in our nature, which are always going to be with us, and there's always going to be some violence, there's always going to be prejudice, there's always going to be lust, there's always going to be vengeance, but we can cap them, we can control them. And again, history tells us that we can, because we have eliminated a lot of barbaric practices that just seem to be permanent parts of the human condition: slavery and human sacrifice, dueling among men of honor, harems and eunuchs, Chinese foot binding, going out for to laugh at the insane in an insane asylum as a form of family entertainment, public hangings, capital punishment for shoplifting. There's a long list of things that used to be unexceptionable that we have got rid of, and they're, even though bad things can always happen, it's unlikely that we're going to go back to human sacrifice, to cutting the heart out of a person as a way of placating angry gods.
I certainly hope so.
Yeah, right.
I think maybe we can maybe talk about this, but I think maybe sometimes we resort to kind of symbolic versions of those things, right?
Well, we do, and if there's some, I think we absolutely do, and that's okay. I mean, that's an improvement. That is, it's better to have, as bad as it is to have, flame wars on Twitter, it's better than, gang wars with guns and knives. That's
definitely true. I would far prefer that. You can always put your phone down.
Exactly. Yes.
Right. But actually, you said a lot there, and I really wanted to ask you actually, because I don't recall if I've heard you quite describe yourself. People ascribe to you this role of optimist, right? But I've also heard it, that optimism and pessimism are biases, right? One can be biased in one way or the other. And that doesn't really seem to me to be a good description of you, because you're looking at the numbers, you're looking at data, and you're looking at just the trends and the way they seem to work, and just saying, well, the only reasonable conclusion here is that things are getting better, or things have gotten better, and that
things have gotten better,
but effort. Right.
No, I'm glad you said that, because that's exactly right. I mean, there's optimism just in the sense that there exists the possibility to solve problems. Right. Evidence being the fact that we have solved them in the past. You call, I suppose you could call that optimism. There's a term that I don't know if Matt Ridley introduced it, but he used it as the title of his book, The Rational Optimist, which is not that, as you say, to assume that things will always get better is a bias, and there's no reason to adopt it. However, just looking at historical data makes one a little more sanguine about the human condition, simply because it's invisible to people who get their information about the world from the news. The news is a highly non-random biased sample, whereas the data which count up, how many people are in poverty? How many people have died of infectious disease? How many people have been killed in wars? You plot that over time, and that's what allows the realization to sink in that we have made progress. But none of the curves are linear for good things or decline for bad things. They're always wiggles and ups and downs, and sometimes sickening lurches. Right. So, and there's nothing. And progress can be undone. Again, I don't think it's just like, the hemlines go up, the hemlines go down. Everything changes wait long enough, and we'll swing back. That everything is cyclical. That's not true either. History is not cyclical, but it has a huge, unpredictable, random component. I think superimposed, at least in many cases, on overall improvement. War being an example, though there has been, first of all, the decline of war really only meaningfully started after World War II. Before that, I would not be prepared to argue that there was an overall trend in reducing war. And World War II is the biggest war in history, of course. Since World War II, the trend has been overall down, but with kind of a roller coaster, because there were bumps for the Vietnam War, the Iran-Iraq War, the Syrian Civil War. There will probably be a bump. We don't know how big for the war in Ukraine. And again, there's no guarantee that it won't shoot all the way back up. I suspect it won't, but it could happen. And it's all the more reason that we figure out why there was an overall downward trend, so that we implement just those measures that caused it and not get complacent. I think there is a danger often that people living in improved circumstances can forget how bad it was and forget about all of the institutions that actually bestowed on us this gift of peace and prosperity. And if we do forget them, then we can go back because there's nothing inevitable about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. So, and there's also just this kind of, I guess it's some version of narcissism of small difference where, we leap to the next plateau of comfort and safety. And then suddenly whatever problems we're facing there get outsized in comparison to what we've overcome or what we're lucky enough to be born having our predecessors already surpassed, right?
That's exactly right. Exactly right. Yes, you can. I mean, our lens can be focused on today and the fluctuations of the last few weeks or even years, and forget about the picture over decades and sometimes centuries.
Right. Right. And it actually leads me to another thing that I thought of, which is the other dichotomy is between idealism and cynicism, which I get all the time as someone, I consider myself an idealist, but I think people have the idea that idealism is similar to that description of optimism that you gave. We're like, oh, everything's going to be fine, right? Or I think everything is already fine, right? But to me, idealism is kind of an ambition. It's a goal. It's saying, I know what I believe is the right thing or the thing we should be aiming for, and I'm actively pursuing it. But people have this cynical side where they say, oh, the fundamental aspects of human nature can't change, and so it seems silly to be so optimistic or idealistic. What do you think of that?
I think that's right. And idealism should not be, or at least rational idealism, shouldn't be where things will naturally get better, or that every effort at improvement will succeed. But just that there's a space of possibilities, a space of solutions. There's a mindset in which if we try to pinpoint the source of our problems and mitigate them, then we can sometimes succeed. And we're not smart enough that we'll come up with a solution on the first try, or that a solution that seems good on paper will actually work. That's why we have to be empirical about it. That's why we have to be scientific. Scientific not in the sense of imposing some theory from the top down, but in the sense of being humble about your understanding of reality and being prepared for reality to show that you're wrong. That's what real science consists of. And which is all the more reason why the values of freedom of thought, freedom of speech, open debate, open criticism are so essential. And it's precisely because we're not smart enough to figure out how to solve problems on the first try. Each one of us thinks we are. That's a bias in human cognition. We're overconfident about our wisdom and our own morality, for that matter. It's very easy to think, I'm good, the people who disagree with me are bad. I'm wise, the people who disagree with me are stupid. So obviously they should be shut up and people should listen to me. Now, of course, everyone thinks that. And you step back and you realize, well, we can't all be right. And the solution is have an arena with rules in which people can say things and other people can criticize them. We criticize them in the sense of whose arguments are most coherent, whose arguments seem to be most in touch with reality, to be prepared to change your mind. That's hard to do individually, but certainly as a group, we can say, well, let's listen to the different proposals and see which ones work. And it's by that means that that science progresses through peer review, open debate, empirical testing. And one could argue that's the way democracies improve. That is, we try things out. We try not to repeat our mistakes. We try to keep things that work. We don't know a priori. We got to try them and listen to what might be wrong with them, and bit by bit try to do the things that work.
Right. There are so many fascinating dichotomies in human nature that you just pointed out there. And it's funny that it struck me as you were talking earlier about, you wrote The Blank Slate, and people got really upset with you about that book and about the idea that, no, we're not blank slates. We do kind of come in pre-programmed, and we have to be mindful of that and do something about that. they got mad at you for this, at least the perceived nihilism of that, right? But then on the other end, we have you writing Enlightenment Now and The Better Angels of Our Nature, and talking about how, despite this not being a blank slate, we have done so much and we've improved so much, and then people get mad at you about that.
Yes, right.
So
yes,
it's a funny tension there.
Maybe the generalization people just get mad at me, but but yes, that's right. And it is, what I've tried to do. I can't claim to be the only person who's done this. Is to try to resolve that apparent tension, that apparent paradox, namely, human nature exists. That has sometimes been associated with conservative, reactionary ideologies because, well, you can't change human nature, and war is in our genes, and so it's naive to hope that we can ever eliminate it. But I come to this as a cognitive psychologist and a psycholinguist. What gives me the claim to have anything to say about war and human history and human progress? Well, the reason is that understanding of both history and potentialities for the future do hinge on a understanding of human nature. In fact, political ideologies have sometimes been defined by their commitments to the existence and nature of human nature. And the view of human nature as a complex system that has both inner demons and better angels is a way to, I think, reconcile the fact that there's been an awful lot of nastiness in human history. There still is. There have also been improvements if you look at the data. How can we reconcile them? And the answer is through the complexity of human nature and the implementation of norms and laws and bodies of knowledge and institutions and mechanisms of interaction, enabled by language, enabled by our ability to think up new institutions, new norms, and with that tension or interplay or dialectic among the different parts of human nature, that's how we can make sense of progress. I'll add one other key idea, and again, this comes from my background as a cognitive psychologist, which is that one of the components of human nature is the ability to recombine old ideas, to come up with new ideas in the same way that you can combine atoms to form molecules or letters of the alphabet to form words or words to form sentences, that there, with some building blocks and rules of combination, there can be an infinite number of combinations. The open-ended combinatorial nature of thought, and the open-ended combinatorial power of language, the fact that we have rules of syntax that allow us to embed a sentence within a sentence. Not only do I think that he's a good guy, but she knows that I think that he's a good guy, and he understands that she knows that I think that. We can embed ideas within ideas and come up with an infinite number of new ideas and share them, thanks to the combinatorial power of language, of cognition, and of language to express our thoughts. So that's another part of the puzzle that is explaining how human nature exists, B, improvement is possible.
Yeah, absolutely. You reminded me actually of, I recall Bill Maher saying this a few times on his show, the world would be such a better place if everyone just listened to me, right?
Right.
And
it's a great summary of one component of human nature. And then the next step is, once the point of the joke, of course, is that, Bill Maher knows that he is not the genius who solved all the world's problems. That's why it's funny. Right. If he meant it seriously, he'd be a lunatic. The fact that he meant it as a joke makes the point that everyone thinks that. And that, by the way, this is a nice example of the recursive combinatorial power of cognition. That is, he said it, but we also understand it as not something that he means, but something that he offers as a pose to get us to make the further leap that, well, of course he believes that, and everyone believes that, and they can't all be right. Right. Therefore, knowing that thought about our thoughts, what do we do now? Well, that's why we have institutions like parliaments where you have debate, like a court system where you have adversarial process, academia where you have, at least in theory, freedom of inquiry, freedom of speech, because, like Bill Maher, everyone thinks the world would be better if people listen to me, but I can't all be right. What do we do about it? Well, what we do about it is we give people the ability to say what they think, but we also give them the ability to collectively try to evaluate all of these claims.
Yeah, and that brings me kind of to the larger discourse, which I'm sure you're aware of as well. You're on Twitter as well. You've seen the mayhem that goes on there, and I'm of the opinion actually that we have more control over how Twitter is than we might think. I just wrote a piece for Newsweek, an opinion piece, basically saying this. Twitter can be awful, but it can also be glorious, and I personally approach Twitter in a particular way, and it has reaped many benefits for me. I've met wonderful people. I've had incredible interactions and disagreements with people in good faith, right? So it's completely possible. This idea that Twitter is sort of designed to be a cesspool is not quite true. But I think the fact is that so much of the responsibility is on us, right? And that leads me to the idea of the larger discourse, right? All the things that you're saying, I'm totally with you, but it seems easy for people to forget, or it seems easy for people's, inner demons to get hijacked and to be teased out. It seems so much more difficult for the better angels to be pulled out. And it seems so much more difficult for people to summon those better angels themselves, right? So what can we do? What do you think are some good things everyday people can do?
Yeah, and you raise some profound issues about how exchange of ideas can be constructive or not. Because, and this is something that we have learned, and that I think perhaps I have been surprised at, that opening up channels of communication is not by itself enough to push a community toward toward understanding, toward truth, toward progress. It depends on the rules of the game, the norms that govern the interactions. And simply opening the floodgates by itself won't do it. Probably because of all of the biases that we have. We all think that we're right. We all think that people who disagree with us are stupid and evil. What do you do about that when everyone thinks that, in order to move the community toward better truth? There has to be commitments to certain epistemic values, like attack the idea, not the person, be responsive to empirical reality, and have other people be there to hold your feet to the fire. These are the kind of rules that allowed newspapers early in the 20th century to transition from pretty much sources of fake news. And when the rotary press made newspapers cheap and available, they were full of nonsense, of claims of sea monsters and civilizations on Mars and conspiracy theories, what we call the era of yellow journalism. And then newspapers kind of got their act together. They formed a society that established standards of fact-checking and sourcing and printing of corrections, and a reputation for accuracy. Likewise, the advent of science came with scientific institutions like the Royal Society and scientific journals that they used peer review and open criticism, and democracy. In all of these cases, people had to sort of think about what are the rules of engagement that will make it not just a free-for-all where everyone spouts off their own nonsense, but a way in which the whole community can move toward better understanding. It's a point that Jonathan Rauch makes effectively in his book, The Constitution of Knowledge. He's another person you may want to have on this series. And the difference between, at one extreme, you've got Twitter at its worst, which is, as you call it, just a cesspool of catcalls and insults and sometimes slander. And say something like Wikipedia, which is not by no means perfect, but it's still, considering that it's so distributed and diffuse, it's actually quite remarkable how accurate it is. And the reason is that people can't just make any old edits and hope for them to stay. There are overarching principles, like a commitment to sourcing, objectivity, viewpoint neutrality. They don't always work. There are wars in the Wikipedia back rooms, but on the whole, the system has been more successful than anyone would predict. So in Twitter, the question, the as yet unsolved problem is are there mechanisms that would steer it toward more responsibility and less insults, trolling, character assassination.
I wonder though if we can count on the algorithms or the systems or the structures themselves to help us with that. I mean, I think we should be concerned about it, and I think we should do what we can. But it seems to me that so much of the impetus is going to be on us individually to just behave better.
Yeah.
Because, as I wrote in that piece that I mentioned, it's only half true that the algorithms are designed to stoke polarization and to make us angry and agitated with one another and present to us things that are going to piss us off. Really, what it's trying to do is get and keep our attention. And it just so happens that those things are great ways to do that. But it doesn't have to be that way. That's kind of the point that I'm making. Do you see that, or do you think that maybe there's a more kind of overarching way that we should approach this?
Yeah, it's. I think it's an unsolved problem. I think this is an important point, and it's, I think, all too easy, as it is with almost any issue, to find a villain and blame the villain. And if only we could eliminate evil, our problems would be solved. And in this case, I think it's people are too quick to blame it on the algorithms of big tech. Although they surely deserve some of the blame. But I just remember going back, being kind of an early adopter of internet technology. I was a professor at MIT for 21 years, and so and I was a member of communities like neural network modeling and cognitive science that were early users of online bulletin boards and discussion groups. And back in the 80s, before anyone was on the internet, before there was an internet, there were things like the ARPANET and the BitNet. I was a member of online scientific discussion groups, and we kind of collectively realized that it was all too easy for discussions to degenerate into what at the time were called flame wars. And the noun aflame, the verb to flame, apparently it came from at least according to one etymology, from an award called the Flaming Asshole Award for people who were just too nasty in these discussion groups, and of which the prize was called the asbestos cork. But it was a realization then when these things were young. I think it was a small enough community that everyone came to realize it was all too easy for disagreements to degenerate into recrimination and insult. And there was a kind of tone policing, constructive tone policing, that someone would be called out and ostracized if they were kind of polluting the discourse by resorting to ad hominem nastiness. Now, it was a small enough community with enough of a kind of reputation management. You didn't want to be the asshole among people who you might be reviewing your grant proposal or you bump into in conferences. And so, I think they became, there were definitely heated debates on these forums, but just the potentiality for them to degenerate into nastiness was recognized. And that there were no algorithms to make anything viral. This was just a fixed number of people who signed up and got it in their email box every day. So there is something in human nature that makes it all too easy, especially when we have the anonymity or the pseudo-anonymity of no face-to-face contact, where there are ordinary human reactions where it's harder to call someone an idiot to their face than to type it in on your keyboard. And those restraints are missing. Scaled up to Twitter, where the community is in the thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions, there is no reputation regulation or very, very little. These problems have come roaring in our roaring back, and we haven't figured out what the equivalent is to make the disagreements more civil.
Yeah, so we definitely have not.
No, we need the asbestos cork award.
Well, the thing is that we have sort of versions of that, right? Like being blocked on Twitter by some prominent person, but then we have people taking it as badges of honor, right? We have, people will screenshot the fact that they're blocked and then tweet about it and go, aha, finally I've annoyed this person to the point where they blocked me, or, they can't take criticism or whatever. There's a way to spin it where it becomes a badge of honor for your tribe. It's all about the signaling.
Oh yeah, no, and that's happened to me. I have an associate that monitors my Twitter feed and will block people who libel me with obscene accusations, and that itself became a brouhaha a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it can get crazy.
Yeah,
it can get crazy. But it's funny because you brought up the Wikipedia thing, and I can imagine what those intense back channel arguments are like, and they're probably nothing like what Twitter is like for a few fundamental reasons, right?
They can get heated, and I'm not a Wikipedia editor or writer, but I read about the kind of the boiler room of Wikipedia. They can get heated, and editors are expelled in some very controversial areas. There have been there's some bad blood, but still, considering the millions of Wikipedia entries, is just remarkable on the whole how good it is.
Yeah, and it seems to me what I was going to point to was that Wikipedia is a very specific platform with a very specific purpose, and the people who are invested enough in it to become editors and contributors have that purpose in mind, right? They must be interested in creating and curating these articles and making sure they're informative. So that already kind of selects out a certain group of people. And so, even if the arguments become very intense and even horrible, they're still kind of under the umbrella of that shared purpose, right? But I think we don't necessarily have a shared purpose for social media. People come to it with different ideas of what they're going to get out of it.
Oh, absolutely. I think you really put your finger on it, that the successful forums are ones where there is people accept that the overall goal is to get at reality, to get at the truth. Now, of course, the problem being that everyone thinks they know the truth, namely their own opinion. But that meta realization, I think I'm always right, but so does everyone else, and what are we going to do about it? That's that. And when you have communities, such as responsible journalism, such as science and academia, when it works well, certainly under threat, that's when you can get accumulation of knowledge.
Yeah. And I wonder if everyone's kind of framework going into social media was, this is this wonderful opportunity to communicate with people I may never have met otherwise in my entire life. Well, how different it would be.
That's right. I mean, part of the problem is that unlike the electronic discussion groups of the 1980s, even if you had a community of several hundred, that's different from a community of several 100,000 or several tens of millions.
Right.
And so the constraints of concern for professional reputation and at least the possibility of either face-to-face or other contact doesn't exist. And there people tend to be much more unrestrained. They don't have to worry about the other guy getting their grant proposal to review.
Right. But that leads me again to, the question of what can we do? How can we encourage people to have better strategies or better frameworks in mind so that these platforms and these interactions can be more productive?
Yeah, good question. I wish I had the answer. I mean, it's a few things that would at least, there may be like ingredients or little nudges in the right direction. Certainly a greater awareness of the fact of human bias, the fact that we are all fallible, that we all think we're infallible, and we can't all be right. Yeah. Some of the values of the so-called rationality community, epistemic humility, of awareness of biases, of such as the availability bias, the fact that we estimate the prevalence of things that are available in memory, salient anecdotes, the thinking in stereotypes, desire for social prestige, temptation to attack a straw man rather than a steel man, moving the goalposts, all of the informal fallacies of reasoning that should become more common knowledge. We're all vulnerable to them. Let's try not to waste our time just each of us succumbing to our biases, but figuring out how we could overcome them. And it's not part of our conventional wisdom. At least it's not commonly taught in elementary or secondary or even college education. It's not part of the culture of op-eds or book reviews. So one part of what I'm not going to say this is going to solve the problem, but at least one necessary condition is that an awareness of cognitive fallacies and biases and the rules that are designed to overcome them should be a bigger part of our conventional wisdom. There could be changes to the algorithms, and people like Jonathan Haidt and Jonathan Rauch and others have discussed that maybe that the possibility of snowball effects, of positive feedback loops in which things are just so easy to retweet that you can easily get a mob psychology where something is rising and so you tweet that and that makes it rise even farther. Maybe there should be a little bit of friction, a little bit of damping, so that those dynamics where for arbitrary reasons something gets traction and then it explodes should be inhibited.
Yeah. I've seen there have been a couple of things where, Twitter will ask you, like, are you sure you want to retweet this without having read the article? It notices that you hadn't clicked.
Yeah, there's that. I mean, that's it could be one solution, one at least proposal is that you can't automatically retweet beyond a certain number of retweets. So you have to actually copy and paste the content instead of just clicking a button, and that would introduce a little bit of friction into the system.
Yeah, interesting. I wonder if that just becomes a kind of co-evolution thing where, the harder the shell gets, the sharper the teeth get, and it just keeps going forever.
It could be, but not necessarily, because it could also be like a nudge where the default is that people are lazy. They won't turn the page and read the print on the back and tick off a box. So that if you align the lazy thing with the good thing, you get a lot of goodness. That's the idea behind Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein's nudge. So, for example, if you have to tick a box to donate an organ if you're killed in an accident, not that many people do it. If you have to tick a box to opt out, then even if people who had an objection to their organs being harvested could always opt out, so it's not authoritarian. But if you just change the default, what involves 3 seconds of effort, you get a huge change in the rates for compliance. And so that does open up the possibility that some changes to the architecture of social media may not be nullified by countermeasures, but just might work with human laziness.
Yeah, it's definitely a rule of project management that if you want someone to do something, make it as easy as possible for them to do it, right? So I guess right. It makes perfect sense. I wanted to ask you actually, because one ditch that I see us falling into a lot, and I did poke John McWhorter about this as well. So as a psycholinguist, as someone who has studied this as well, I'm curious about how you feel about the euphemism treadmill, and can we ever actually get off of it? I think you're the person that I learned about that concept from, and it really clicked in my head. And I see so much of our trouble being misfires and friendly fire as a result of labeling a person or a group of people with this kind of umbrella term that may or may not suit them or fit them properly. And that just causes so much unnecessary miscommunication. So woke is one that, it's going around. And I'm curious if you think we can ever escape that sort of thing. It seems so ingrained in us to want to do that.
Well, yes, it's and the euphemism treadmill, which I may have coined. It's hard to.
I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure if it was.
I mean, I didn't get it from anyone else, but it doesn't mean that someone didn't pick it up before me. Which is,
okay.
if you when you pursue etymologies, you often find that no matter what it is, it's always older than you think. It's kind of the first rule of etymology. Anyway, I may have coined it, but it refers to I wrote, this is way back in 1994 when I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, around the time that African-American was replacing Black as the preferred term. And the reason that it was salient for me is I'm old enough to have remembered when Black replaced Negro. And Negro now sounds not only archaic, almost maybe it's even racist. Who knows? Although, of course, for many decades it was the acceptable term. That's what James Baldwin and Martin Luther King used. And we had the United Negro College Fund. I remember in college having a history professor, who kept referring to Negroes, and it struck me as vaguely racist, even though he wasn't. But he was just older than me, and he had not yet assimilated the change then. But then there was a second change, to African American. It hasn't replaced Black, and Black doesn't sound, I don't think sounds racist to anyone. But it often happens that a term that's brought in to somehow escape some of the negative connotations of a concept will then soak up those connotations in turn and need to be replaced in its turn. And this is something that linguists have long recognized. So we have changes from, say, crippled to handicapped to disabled, Oriental to Asian, retarded, which now has, when you think about it, it was it literally just means slowed down. It was introduced as the most non-derogatory way of referring to people with, say, Down syndrome and other forms of cognitive impairment as possible, compared to its predecessors like idiot, imbecile, and moron, which originally were technical terms. But then they became so insulting that there had to be a replacement. But then each one of those in turn became tainted. And now apparently retarded itself has become so taboo that it's referred to as the R word. Right. That's another example of a euphemism treadmill. So part of it is that unless we shouldn't, even though clearly we want sensitive ways of referring to people that don't saddle them with some negative connotation. One can see the rationale for it. But we also shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking that by changing the language, we can change the attitudes. And often it's when the attitudes change that the treadmill stops. So Oriental became Asian, but then Asian is pretty much stuck for 30 or 40 years. And probably it's because despite I think exaggerated rumors that there's been a huge rise in anti-Asian racism, it's still an ethnic group that is less susceptible to racism than others. And so there hasn't been a need to find some, to call it the A word or to find some replacement for that.
Well, I think, well, the R word, quote unquote, is something that I grew up with in the sense that it was used as, a derogatory term. And, there are other words that are similar that in my upbringing, just in the time where I happened to be growing up, it's just something you would say like, oh, that's retarded. Or like, what are you, retarded? Right.
Now, careful, you get canceled from this video.
Well, the interesting thing about that, though, is that even as a younger person and, knowing people who had developmental disabilities, mental disabilities, who would be called, clinically speaking, retarded, mentally retarded, those two, the words kind of diverged in meaning depending on context. So when I would say like, oh my God, that movie was totally retarded, or whatever. And sometimes that would actually not be a negative thing. It would be like, oh my God, it was so crazy that I loved it. Right. Yeah. So there's context within context.
Right. You like calling something sick or bad. It could could be good. Right. No, I know that's right. Clearly, and of course, context makes all the difference, exactly as you point out. That's, again, one of the first laws of linguistics is that most words have multiple meanings. They are generally effortlessly disambiguated in context. That's just the way human language understanding works. And it's one of the reasons why it's been so hard to simulate language in artificial intelligence systems is that you and I apply the totality of our social and psychological knowledge in getting at the intent of the speaker, something that AI systems as yet can't do. But it's also something that is easily forgotten in the language policing that convicts people of mentioning words that are taboo out of the context of why were they mentioning it. The editor of the New York Times, who was fired for having a discussion with students about the N-word, in which he actually mentioned it. And I mean, it was totally idiotic that he was not only fired, but then subsequently kind of tainted as a racist in articles that said he left his job because he used the racial slur. Well, he actually didn't use it to introduce the technical term. He mentioned it. That is, acting as a linguist, he was having a discussion about that word. The fact that our culture, including elite institutions like the New York Times, including elite institutions like universities who have fired professors for mentioning it in class, that is, I'm not going to use the R word, but that is making our culture stupid in the sense that a basic distinction that's not that hard to understand. Kids know the difference between talking about a word as a word and actually using it. But our drive to demonize and assassinate people has become so strong that elementary cognitive distinction is people have to pretend that they no longer understand it and treat words as a kind of magic where the mere emission of a sound coming out of someone's mouth can have dreadful consequences. The kind of mindset that was behind curses and prayers and word magic that you'd think we'd overcome, that we know enough now that linguistics is a thing, that you can actually think about how language works. You can say, well, the power of language comes from its use in context and the attribution of intent to the speaker. A basic point that seems to have been forgotten, including among our elite institutions, which is worrying.
Yeah. And actually, an even more egregious example, which I've written about, is the case of Greg Patton, who was giving a lecture on filler words. Or I don't even think he was giving a lecture on it, but he used the Chinese filler word nega, which sounds like the word we're not supposed to say. And just the mention of a similar sounding combination of syllables was enough for it to flare up, right? Whether it was sincere or not doesn't matter, I think, because the flare up happened.
That is the prototypical example of how universities have become stupid.
It's just crazy, But I think, the point that I made, which I'm curious about your opinion, is that we can't escape the kind of attribution of context. It's just, and when people say that impact matters more than intent, they still care about intent. They're just kind of deciding what the intent was for you, regardless of what you think. It's actually just, the impact based on the perceived intent. Like, it doesn't matter. Just you, Steven Pinker, if you utter those syllables because you have the melanin that you have, or how little melanin you have, because those syllables came out of your lips rather than mine, doesn't matter what you meant. I'm going to assume that you meant the worst possible thing. So it's still, context is still at play there.
I don't even know. I think that might even be crediting too much. It's not as if... it's not as if, I forget the name of the guy, the Times, the name is just suddenly Neil, I think. Anyway,
Donald McNeil.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah. So it's not even as if, I think it's even dumber than what you just said. It's not that, well, deep down he really was a racist, because no one's actually made that accusation, because you can't, because he's not. It's rather that the mere emission of that sound can have dreadful consequences. And it's actually telling people what the impact is. And in fact, creating the very reality that it ought to be combating, namely that a sound can can do harm, can make you, wither and crumble and lose your confidence, even if it's being a part of an intellectual discussion that is intended to actually to lessen the power and impact of these slurs. Namely, they're just words. You're really not going to die. Racism as an attitude is despicable, but we're not so stupid that we can't discuss racism as a phenomenon. And one of the ways of disarming racists of one of their weapons is to say, even if they use that word, it's just a word. It's not like, it's not a bullet. It's not a discriminatory policy. Let's understand what's going on. And instead of telling people, you're going to be hurt, you're going to crumble, you're going to wither, you're going to have no response. If anyone even mentions this word in a discussion, we should be fortifying people and equipping people with the intellectual tools to understand what's going on, such as this is words, because of quirks of our psychological makeup, can have an effect on our emotional responses. Yeah, your brain has a response when a certain sound comes in, but let's step back and figure out why, and that way we can control these responses and not get hurt at trivial discussions.
Yeah. Well, there's the issue of charity, which is what we've been talking about, where what the person intended should matter, but then there's also the issue of practicality that you're bringing up right now, which is even if a particular word or image is traumatic for me because of my experience or because of my perspective and framework that I'm operating under. If for example, I had a family member who died in a factory accident, right? If I'm watching a movie and there's a factory accident, I may get triggered by that, right? I may feel certain feelings. I may get really upset. It may remind me of things I wish I didn't have to think about, and I may get terribly upset. To me, I think that's perfectly fine and understandable, even though I may caution people that, it might not be healthy to kind of just leave that way. But I think then what happens next is the tricky part. What happens next is if I decide to get angry at the director of that film because they decided to write a scene where this happens, didn't you know that I would get upset about this? How could you do this, right? It's a strange, impractical way of kind of outsourcing your own equanimity to others, which becomes just practically impossible.
Absolutely. Also, it makes us less equipped to understand history if we are, if out of emotional sensitivity, we can't confront some of the uglier things that happen in the world and that happened in the past. Images from the Holocaust, from Hiroshima, from various from atrocities and genocides. They are upsetting. They should be upsetting, and of lynchings and of racist violence and pogroms and ethnic riots. On the other hand, we're really better off if we know that they happened and if we know how bad they were. We don't have to rub our noses in it indefinitely, but we should not be shielded from it out of a concern that we'll just feel so bad that it's better that we are ignorant of them. We're not better off ignorant of them. We're better off cognizant of them. All the better to prevent them from happening in the future.
And I think we're better off finding ways to personally overcome them, right? In terms of being able to detach to a certain extent so that we can deal with these things. Because dealing with them often means just seeing the stuff and hearing the stuff, right?
Absolutely. I mean, this is part of what being a grown-up is. We shield kids from upsetting images, but we as adults should be aware of them. And indeed, there is the whole kind of trauma therapy industry that tries to cultivate a vulnerability, sensitivity to adverse events. Can, as my colleague Rich McNally at Harvard put it, can be iatrogenic, the technical term for doctor-induced illness. We can make things worse if we keep telling people, oh, you're going to be permanently damaged and injured by something that happened to you. A mindset that if this did happen to me, I can deal with it. It can be more constructive in getting people to deal with it and lead happy, productive lives.
Yeah. And famously, the kind of backfire of trigger warnings, right? Where,
exactly.
Which to me seemed fairly obvious that, I think, generalizing the trigger warning, like say, hey, by the way, trigger warning, that's going to trigger anybody who has a trigger, instead of it. Well, in fact,
Rich and his student at Harvard, Peyton Jones, I was on his dissertation committee, have shown that trigger warnings can be harmful. That is, they can make people react more negatively to events than if there were no trigger warnings.
Right.
Because
it's
they tell people,
because
you're going to be hurt, you're going to be damaged. Oh, gee, I didn't know that.
Right. And it's kind of, that it seems, it's like it's a tenet of horror films, right? Where the less you are shown, the less of the monster you see, the scarier the movie is.
Yeah, it's true. Yes, that's right. The apprehension builds up. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right. So it seems to me like, hey, there's a monster back here. There's a monster back here. Seems to me to be doing even more of the work of getting people upset and agitated. When, although I guess I can see, parental discretion. Please be advised. There's some graphic images. Yeah.
Well, yeah, for children, but we're not talking about children. We're talking about adults. Or in the case of university students, part of the training that turns you into an adult.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it seems to me the trigger warning for a university should be, you are about to enter a place where ideas are going to get thrown around and you're just going to hear stuff you're not going to like. And that's part of why you're here. I wonder if we should just put that above the door.
Indeed. No, that should be part of our understanding of what being an educated adult consists of.
Yeah. So I actually wanted to ask you about Rationality, your most recent book. And of course, you get tons of pushback about that. Some people say, well, what an obvious book. And other people say, well, people say a bunch of things. But I'm actually curious. I had someone suggest this question when I announced that I would be talking to you. But the question is, why focus on reason when most of our behavior is initiated due to instincts? As in, they're not really conscious or effortful or chosen. They are kind of, we're kind of just along for the ride in a really important sense. We're kind of just observing our own reactions to things.
Well, I think that's there is that undercurrent, but it's not all there is to human behavior. Otherwise, anytime we'd see food, we'd stuff it into our mouth if we were hungry. Every time we'd see an attractive stranger, we'd start to paw them. We'd blurt out everything we see. You see an unattractive or a fat person, and you blurt out. And kids sometimes do that. We kind of find it either embarrassing or endearing.
Yeah.
But adults don't. We do have a faculty of self-control. We do have a faculty of reason. It's what education, both formal in schools and informal in discourse, is designed to draw out and amplify. It's what our institutions are designed to implement on a collective scale. So we have the capacity, and the question is, what does it consist of? How does it work? How can we make it more effective? How do we avoid getting sucked into these biases, which undoubtedly exist? And a lot of the book Rationality consists of explaining some of the well-documented human fallacies and biases. That's something that, of course, others have done, like famously Daniel Kahneman in his famous work with Amos Tversky on human biases in judgment and decision-making, and Richard Thaler and Dan Ariely and others. But in addition, in Rationality, I also had a kind of almost tutorials of what I think are the main tools of reasoning that are the opposite of fallacies. They're the benchmark by which we decide that something is a fallacy, namely reasoning that doesn't conform to these normative models, as they're often called, logic and probability, and Bayesian reasoning, namely calibrating a degree of belief according to strength of evidence, statistical decision theory, rational choice theory, correlation and causation. I have 6 cognitive tools that I think every educated person should master. And it's when we depart from these tools that we say that people are biased or committing fallacies.
Right.
And so I wanted to get those out there. A lot of cognitive psychologists kind of having first documented the ways in which we're irrational. I've often heard just in kind of common discussion, everyone should really know, how Bayes' rule works. It sounds fancier than it is. It's really not that complicated. But it just, we use it as our a yardstick against which we compare human irrationality, but people should, it shouldn't be our secret. And so I wanted to make that known. Then, of course, I couldn't avoid the question of why does there seem to be so much flagrant irrationality around us? What's the deal with the fake news, the medical quackery, and conspiracy theories, the paranormal woo-woo. And so I had a chapter on that, knowing that that was the chapter that everyone would go to first.
That's true. Yeah. So what I hear you saying is that, yes, we have instincts and sort of those other behaviors that are triggered by them and that we're kind of just along for the ride. But reasoning is another one of those tools in our toolkit that just comes prepackaged. And that
yes, exactly. And that, of course, ties back to our earlier conversation on how progress is possible if there's such a thing as human nature. And it's because human nature does include rational faculties that are, by default, we apply them pretty narrowly to our physical surroundings, to keeping food in the fridge and gas in the car, and the kids clothed and fed. And the challenge is, how do we extend that mindset to more politically and ideologically charged arenas where we tend not to apply rationality, but rather tribalism and passion and demonization.
Right. So how do we do that? What do you think?
Well, again, this sort of ties back to some of the themes that you and I have been talking about. How do we implement kind of social norms and rules that marginalize our biases and that bring out our more rational angels? And they include things like free speech, open debate, empirical testing, norms of criticizing the argument, not the person, of criticizing an argument in its strong form, not its straw form. That set of norms and principles that implement them, such as the Wikipedia community's overarching commitment to objectivity, viewpoint neutrality, sourcing, that whole set of values and norms.
Yeah. I'm reminded now of, one thing that I do, just because I'm also kind of a dick, especially when I was younger. I remember around 2012 when, the whole end of the world thing was happening again. That was another year where the whole thing was supposed to go down. And I, of course, was skeptical of this. And there were people who were fairly convinced and were getting themselves ready. And, I didn't go through with it because I felt like it was too mean. But I had the idea of just kind of walking around with a sign saying like, hey, if you think you're going to be raptured, or if you think it's all over, I'll, transfer your money into my bank account. You won't need it anyway. And of course, the idea there being that their rationality will kick in right there and go, I'm not going to give you my money, right? Like, that's silly, right?
Well, that's actually profound. I mean, it's a joke, but it's actually profound in a couple of ways. One of them is that you're absolutely right that what people believe, when it comes to these cosmic, eschatological or metaphysical realms, people don't often have the courage of their convictions. Belief is not the same as belief as is there beer in the fridge or not, where it's just empirical reality, and your ideology has nothing to do with it. It's either true or false, and you can check. Here, you're right that people espousing beliefs, a lot of religious beliefs, a lot of political beliefs, a lot of conspiracy theories, they're just sharing an attitude, and if you ask them to put their money where their beliefs are, where their mouths are, they would probably desist.
At least some of them.
At least some of them. No, it's true. There were the people who literally drank the Kool-Aid at Jonestown. There were the Heaven's Gate people who killed themselves thinking that their souls would be whisked to a UFO behind the Hale-Bopp comet. There was the guy who burst into the pizzeria in the Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria with his gun blasting to save the children who were the victims of the Hillary Clinton's pedophile ring. But there are a lot more people who I think, like your end of the world preppers, when they say they believe something, it's part of their identity, but they aren't willing to act on it. And it's interesting you brought up these end of the world cults, because you could say historically that our entire awareness of cognitive biases and fallacies originated from a study of one of those cults way back in 1950, when two famous social psychologists, Leon Festinger and Stanley Schachter, infiltrated one of these cults. And their kind of mischievous plan was to see what would happen when the date rolled around and the world didn't end. How would they respond to it? And they found some of them did fall away. They were kind of crushed. Oh, damn, the world didn't end after all. But some of them doubled down, and they came up with rationales. They rationalized the failure of the prediction by saying, oh, we did a little mathematical error, or there was some condition that failed to hold, so it's going to be postponed. That's what led to the famous theory of cognitive dissonance, which every intro psych student is exposed to.
Yep.
And it's one of the first academic exposés of a widespread cognitive bias, in this case, rationalization. And indeed, you kind of recapitulated it in your own little mini experiment of holding people's feet to the fire with these apocalyptic beliefs and see what happens when they don't come true.
Yeah, right. Suddenly doubt starts to creep in, whether you want it to or not. And you're like,
or you spin, you hold a sacred belief and you spin the rest of your belief system to protect it, which was the whole theory of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, right. And then the common thing for me, the most common one that I've observed, is the kind of phasing into metaphor. Oh, we didn't literally mean it. It was a spiritual end, and that sort of stuff.
There you go. That's another one of the mechanisms, right?
So, Stephen, before we let you go and ask the last question that we ask every guest, I wanted to ask you another thing that someone suggested, which is, what can parents specifically do or not do to help improve their children's chances of kind of being more rational people, of operating in the way that we've been discussing, giving them those tools kind of early on. What I always say is that we don't get an instruction manual for our brains. And it'd be really great if we did. Introspection is not doesn't come pre-programmed. Not all of us are enjoy thinking about thinking as much as you and I might. But what can parents do?
I think it is to weave into conversation, the various traps and vulnerabilities to errors and biases and fallacies. If someone if there's a story on the news and someone says, well, it's things are really getting worse, you can say, well, gee, that's just one example. The country has millions of people. How is that really a trend, or is it just one viral image? They're just weaving into just conventional wisdom of making sense of world events and of everyday events. If someone misinterprets correlation as causation, have that be a thing. Correlation doesn't prove causation. If necessary, with the use of jokes and humor, like my grandfather's joke, which I think he had to have been born in Poland in 1900 to appreciate, of the man who gorged himself on bean stew and tea and then lay in pain, moaning that the tea made him sick. It's not the funniest joke, but he thought it was uproarious. And it's a way of inserting into our background understanding of the world that we're susceptible to confusing correlation with causation. And that's just one out of many examples, but it should be part of our collective awareness.
Yeah. So basically, modeling it and voicing it when the opportunity arises, I guess.
And sometimes naming it, as in the case of the mantra, correlation doesn't imply causation. It's a lot of syllables, but it's become, fortunately, it's become enough of a cliche that at least it can pop into mind at opportune moments.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure what you're working on now, but if I may pitch to you, Rational Baby, kind of a spin-off book. Those things tend to be doing... Yeah, they tend to do pretty well, those kind of spin-off books.
You're right. It's a niche that probably I won't fill, but it's there for someone else to fill.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So Enlightenment Baby and Rational Baby and Blank Slate, Blank Slate Baby. Let's get those printed, guys.
Indeed.
So, Stephen, you've been awesome. It's been such a great conversation. I wanted to make sure to ask you the last question we ask all our guests. As you know, as a FAIR advisor, our focus at FAIR is to provide what we call a pro-human approach to the issues of the day, of our discourse, of race and intolerance, and all of the things that we've been talking about. And so the question for you is, what does pro-human mean to you? And how can people in their everyday lives adopt a more pro-human approach to all of these issues?
Well, what part of the answer is to realize that problems are hard, that they're not the fault of evil people, but of tragedies that face all of us, and that the solution to problems is not to necessarily to attack and demonize and punish other people, but rather to solve problems. That also that the ultimate moral value for everything is the well-being of humans and other sentient creatures. But that the reason that we have concepts like good and bad and evil and virtue is that people can suffer, people can flourish, and that's really what it's all about.
Right. Agreed. Well, Steven Pinker, thank you so much for joining us on Fair Perspectives. It was such an honor to talk to you. I hope we'll do it again.
Pleasure is mine. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Fair Perspectives. If you'd like to support the show, you can do it by subscribing on YouTube and on your favorite podcast platform and leaving us a positive rating and review. You can also access exclusive podcast content, such as Q&As and bonus episodes, by visiting us and signing up at fairperspectives.org. For weekly fair news and opinion pieces by members of the fair community, visit our Substack at fairforall.substack.com and tune into Fair News Weekly wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to join or support the pro-human movement, visit us at fairforall.org/join us. Thanks again, and see you next time.